Okay, so now we rewrite everything in a proper way so that we continue with the analysis. So we have basically come up with a realization that consciousness is basically a function of thoughts and emotions. Now we know that, for example, we were dealing with the idea about life, which is basically a thought about life, and we say that a pure thought about life can be associated with two types of descriptions: that life is good or life is bad, right? And we denote this with that, and we denote this with that, plus QTD2, right? So this is basically what we came up with, and ideally what we have here, we are just saying that the pure thought about life can be equal to the idea that life is good and the idea that life is bad, right? Which just makes pure sense by telling us that in life, someone can associate the pure thought about life with ideas that life is good and an idea that life is actually bad. So, in this regard, now we know that first and foremost, when we want to assume neutralness among these variables, or for example, we want to assume that the pure thought of life does not exist, because the way it is that when a person associates a pure thought with a descriptive thought, the descriptive thought replaces the pure thought. Now, what that means is that, for example, if you had no beliefs about life and then you decide to believe that life is good, it means that the idea of just life being a neutral thing disappears, and what you actually believe in is that life is actually good. So whenever you hear someone talk about life, the first thing that comes to your mind is that it is good, or that life is actually good. So that's the funny thing about consciousness, because our ideas become replaced, right? In other words, again, this is a good thing, because it means that if you have lived your life believing that it is bad, the moment that you begin to believe that life is good, the idea of life being associated with bad becomes replaced with the idea of it being good, right? So in this regard, but remember that, so it means that descriptive thoughts can replace each other. At the same time, whenever descriptive thoughts are associated with the pure thought ceases to exist in that particular person's mind, and what dominates that person's consciousness about that subject, maybe life, becomes the descriptive thought. So in this regard, let's say an individual decides to believe that life is good, right? Or to accept the idea that life is good. It means that this pure thought about life being neutral becomes zero, and now it becomes equal to the descriptive thought that life is good plus the descriptive thought that life is bad. But since this person decides to believe that life is good, it means we take this other side to replace the pure thought, and what we have is a negative D1, which becomes equal to the second descriptive thought that life is bad. Now, in this regard, remember that this has become negative, but we are still solving for the descriptive thought that life is good, because that is what this person has decided to believe. Then you will realize that if we cancel this other side, all we are going to have is QT descriptive thought 1 is equal to negative QT descriptive thought 2. So why this? So now, because we have basically divided this one by the negative. So this is just simply telling us that the idea that life is good is negatively related to the idea that life is bad. That's what this means. Right? That's what that means. And it makes pure sense. It makes sense in that the idea that life is good has got a negative direction in comparison to the idea that life is actually bad. Right? So this is the outcome of replacing the pure thought with a descriptive thought. Now, ideally, this situation holds true, but if the idea that life is good is negatively related to the idea that life is bad, which is represented by the notation descriptive thought 2, it also means that it should be true that the idea that life is actually bad should also be negatively related to the idea that life is good. So this should also be true. So if this is true, it means that this should also be true, right? Then what we now have is now, if these are true, remember that if we go back to our pure thought being either equal to descriptive thought 1 plus descriptive thought 2, it means that if this was our equation that we have, where we have the pure thought about life being either equal to the idea that life is good or the idea that life is bad, it means if we substitute the actual relationships between these two descriptive thoughts, because remember that when you are thinking about something, you must, to be conscious, you must be aware of the opposite, right? For example, you know what life is because you know what the opposite of life is. For example, you know that what life is because you know what death is, right? So the mind cannot be conscious without relationships or without relating something to something else. So the mind, in understanding things, relies on relating things. That is why your current life, you understand it based on how you relate it to your past experiences. So that is why when you come across something new, the first thing that your mind wants to do is to find something it can relate that particular experience to the past experiences. And that is why if someone asks you a question and you don't really know that question, your mind begins to seek for answers based on your past experiences of similar questions. So that's just the nature of the mind. And sometimes when you meet new people who you have never encountered before, you just meet that person, based on that person's appearance, you are more likely to start trying to have ideas about their behavior based on your experiences of people with similar appearances in the past, or maybe people with the same facial expressions in the past. You start trying to relate that person's behavior with those that you have encountered in the past with the same characteristics as that particular person. So that's how the mind operates. So in order to derive the fundamental equation of consciousness, which is the basic equation of consciousness, we need to actually express this outcome of the pure thought in terms of the relations between the descriptive thoughts, these two descriptive thoughts. So, in other words, that will mean that we are saying the pure thought of life, or the pure thought about life, may end up as a descriptive thought in form of, depending on how these two descriptive thoughts actually relate to each other. So in this regard, say we have descriptive thought 1, the relation between descriptive thought 1 and descriptive thought 2 is the negative of descriptive thought 2. So meaning we will say that is equal to negative t d2 minus negative t d1. So the descriptive thought 1 relates to descriptive thought 2 in a negative way. Descriptive thought 2 relates to descriptive thought 1 in a negative way. So in this regard, we have expressed the pure thought in terms of the relationships between the two descriptive thoughts. Now, since the mind relates these two things, we are not going to actually equate the pure thought of life equal to 0, given that we want to demonstrate what will happen given that this individual actually decides to believe that life is actually good. Why? Because without the pure thought, descriptive thoughts cannot exist. For example, if you do not know anything about life, how would you describe that life is bad? How would you describe that life is good? Your descriptions do not make sense because you do not know what life is. So, in other words, for a mind to actually have a perception about something, it must know the root of that particular thing. For example, the root of these descriptive thoughts is basically the pure thought of life, right? So in this regard, what we're trying to say is that now we can demonstrate what happens given that an individual decides to believe that life is good without actually equating the pure thought of life as equal to 0, because that will mean that the pure thought of life will cease to exist, and therefore even the descriptive thoughts will be meaningless. They need to cease to exist. But we don't want the pure thought of life to cease to exist, but we want the pure thought of life to still remain in the equation, but still demonstrate the association of that pure thought of life with these two descriptive thoughts. So, in this regard, given that this individual decides to believe that life is good, which is represented by the descriptive thought 1, it means we take the descriptive thought 1 to the left, and what we have is so we have that, and this makes pure sense. So meaning this is the pure thought and this is the descriptive thought. Okay? So this is also a descriptive thought, but the negative one, right? So now we have that. So this is telling us that the pure thought about life, when added or associated with the descriptive thought that life is good, the combination of these two, when you associate the pure thought of life with a descriptive thought that life is good, that outcome becomes negatively related to the idea that, or the descriptive thought that life is bad. So remember, it just simply means that when you decide to believe that life is actually good, it means that the idea that life is bad becomes a negative idea. So in this regard, these two are simply showing us that these are a combination of a pure thought about life and the descriptive thought about life that it is actually good. So in this case, we can call the combination of a pure thought about life, the combination of a pure thought about life and the descriptive thought that life is good as a composite thought. So I'll denote this as CD1. So C meaning composite. Remember that D is descriptive, so, and 1 just simply means that it's the first priority, or you prefer it more than to the idea that life is bad or stuff like that. So what we're trying to say here now, this is denoting the composite thought of descriptive thought 1, right? So now, why composite? Where is the idea of composite coming from? A composite thought is basically a thought that is formed out of a combination of a descriptive thought and a pure thought. So in actual sense, a composite is something that is made out of 2 or more different things. So in this regard, a descriptive thought is basically a description of a particular pure thought in a particular way. For example, a pure thought, we know that we are talking about life in general, what life is, basically its existence, right? And a descriptive thought has a property of describing that particular existence. So in this regard, D1 represents the idea, the description that life is actually good. So when you associate the pure thought, life, with the idea that life is actually bad, that is a descriptive thought. When you combine those two, you form another kind of thought, which is called a composite thought, because it is a combination of those 2 different thoughts with different ideas. So in this regard, we denote it as composite thought of descriptive thought 1 because it's a composite thought that life is actually good, right? So now, a composite thought, so you will notice that the combination of this system where we have a pure thought plus a particular descriptive thought equated to a negative kind of descriptive thought. This is a belief system. This is a belief system. This is a belief system. Because a belief system should show us what we believe. First and foremost, it should show us what we are thinking about. We are thinking about life. It must show us what we believe about life, which is life is good. And what we don't believe about life, negative, life is bad. You see that? So this is a belief system. Now let me write this properly so that we can clearly see.